Hi, everybody. Welcome to my homestead and welcome to my channel. My name is Jared. I got an email from Gary Vest. The subject line says, President Nelson is almost at the halfway mark. And so I had to see what he was talking about. Jared, this is mind-blowing. Currently, there are 350 temples in operation, under construction, or announced in total. Now, one thing already interesting about that is 350, that's half of 700. You know, we've talked a lot about sevens recently on the channel. We've also talked about other numbers, but that's half of 700. So that by itself is kind of interesting where we're at right now. But continuing, wouldn't it be amazing if President Nelson hit a milestone of announcing half of all the current temples since becoming prophet? Yes, or in other words, doubling the amount of temples since he became president of the church. Continuing, at the time President Nelson took office in 2018, there were only 159 operating temples, with 23 more under construction or announced, for a total of 182 temples. Since then, he has announced 168 temples, additional temples. He's almost there at the halfway mark. If he announces 14 more temples, that would bring the total up to 364 temples, half of which, 182, he would have announced as president of the church. So, okay, so just 14 more, that's 2 sevens, and that would double the number of temples in the church since he became president of the church. And then he continues, that would be amazing if he were to break the halfway mark this year. I think there's a good chance of that. I'd say that's likely. And then he continues, ever since President Nelson became prophet in January 2018, you can say exponentially, quote unquote. Side note, if you were to include the first 3 temples Joseph Smith announced, Independence, Far West, and Adamonte Amen, and the Kirtland Temple, it looks like there's a rocket attack right now in Israel. I have my alerts up because who knows what's going to happen in coming days. Okay, so Independence, Far West, Adamonte Amen, and Kirtland Temple, the total would be 354 temples. Nelson would have to announce 18 more temples to hit the halfway mark at 186 out of 372 temples. And then Gary leaves a link for a church news article that we're going to look at, and then says, cool, huh, Gary? Yes, it is cool. I do want to remind everybody, though, a lot of times we talk about the Temple of Independence, Missouri, or the New Jerusalem. Again, there's going to be 24. The first one had the cornerstones laid, and the spot was identified, and unfortunately it's currently owned by the Church of Christ Temple Lot. But like I've said before many times, there's going to be 24, and the Independence Visitor Center was designed to become part of this complex and be one of the temples. They built it according to the specifications that you can find here on the Joseph Smith papers that were given by Revelation, like the length and the width and the height and stuff like that. And the Independence Visitor Center appears to be temple number 13. So you'd have to include all those temples as well. 24 temples for New Jerusalem. But anyway, let's go to the article. It's called, by the numbers look at the 168 temples announced by President Nelson. Okay, so at the first part here, it says that means that the church's 350 houses of the Lord that are dedicated, under construction, or announced and in planning, President Nelson has announced 48% of that total. So again, he's almost doubled the amount of temples in the church. And I'm sure that him or somebody will mention that whenever that occurs, because that is a pretty big milestone. And this kind of thing has happened in the past, like the number of temples. Yes, they're milestones, but I think that they're significant, and there could be symbolism to it as well, but I don't think it's just like an interesting fact. At the very least, it calls your attention to the fact that the work is hastening, that, you know, we're trying to get things done as quick as possible before the second coming, and then after the second coming, when we're in the millennium, there's going to be a lot of work to do at that point. So a hastening of the work either way. Now, you might remember, or you may not know, President Hinckley, before President Nelson, President Hinckley was recognized as like the temple building prophet because he announced so many. And I want to remind you of a few things that happened back then. So this is the April 1998 General Conference. new temples to provide crowning blessings of the gospel by President Gordon B. Hinckley. And right here, he did something kind of interesting. Now, in conclusion, I wish to make an announcement. This is really cool right here. As I have previously indicated, in recent months we have traveled far out among the membership of the church. I've been with many who have very little of this world's goods, but they have in their hearts a great burning faith concerning this latter-day work. They love the church, they love the gospel, they love the Lord, and want to do his will. They are paying their tithing, modest as it is. They make tremendous sacrifices to visit the temples. They travel for days at a time in cheap buses and on old boats. They save their money and do without to make it all possible. They need nearby temples, small, beautiful, serviceable temples. Accordingly, I take this opportunity to announce to the entire church a program to construct some 30 smaller temples immediately. Now, really quick before I continue, I have already done a video, and I've mentioned this a couple times on the channel, that it was not President Hinckley that came up with the idea of small temples per se, or he wasn't the president of the church that implemented smaller temples. It was actually Spencer W. Kimball. In this video, An Evening with a General Authority, Elder Bednar discussion, he talks about the fact that it was Spencer W. Kimball that first implemented small temples, but what President Hinckley did is he announced like even smaller temples than that and more, like a very large number of temples. But he talks about the fact that revelation for the church, it comes in stages, that usually it's received little by little, and then when it is received, it isn't necessarily implemented right away, that there's like a whole process that it goes through. And so things that we're seeing right now during President Nelson's time, a lot of it probably started all the way back with President Monson or before. And President Nelson is implementing it. And who knows what we'll see in the future after President Nelson, that things that he is, revelation that he's receiving right now for the future. But I would encourage you to check this out. There's also this neat article here, or paper, Events and Changes During the Administration of Spencer W. Kimball, in case you want to know more. But anyway, President Hinckley, more temples and smaller than the previous smaller temples. He says they'll be in Europe and Asia, in Australia and Fiji, in Mexico and Central and South America and Africa, as well as in the United States and Canada. They will have all the necessary facilities to provide the ordinances of the Lord's house. This will be a tremendous undertaking. Nothing even approaching it has ever been tried before. These will be, in addition to the 17 buildings now going forward, and then he lists a bunch of different places. This will make a total of 47 new temples in addition to the 51 now in operation. 51 in operation, geez. April 1998. I think we had better add 2 more to make it an even 100 by the end of this century, being 2,000 years since the coming of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ in the flesh. D&C 20 verse 1. In this program, we are moving on a scale the like of which we have never seen before. So he says in General Conference that they have this goal of 100 by the year 2000, or by the end of the year 2000. So that's kind of interesting. And I think that this has been done before. I feel like there's reason to believe that President Nelson is doing this now, that he's like setting goals like this, like X amount of temples by this year. And I'll show you why I believe that. Okay, so he says that, and then at the time, Elder Ballard of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles in October 1998 General Conference, Are We Keeping Pace? This is the General Conference after the one that we were just looking at with President Hinckley. He says, at our last General Conference, President Gordon B. Hinckley made the historic announcement that 30 or more smaller temples will be constructed throughout the world. Now look at this. I didn't know this. I didn't put this together. The first of those smaller temples was dedicated this summer in Monticello, Utah. Now, we have talked about that temple a number of times because during the October 14th, 2023 eclipse, it was an annular eclipse, not a total eclipse, but there is a path of annularity. and you can see it right here. I downloaded these KML files from NASA for Google Earth, and the path of annularity for that eclipse went through Utah and it missed all the temples except for one. You had the Manti Temple that was decommissioned at the time for renovations. The only operating temple that was in the path of annularity was the Monticello, Utah temple right here. And it just so happens that this was the first of this series of much smaller temples that President Hinckley announced. So that's another interesting layer to this whole thing with the eclipses. You know, remember the other eclipses, they went over the paths of totality, went over Adam-Yaman, Far West, New Jerusalem, or Independence, Missouri, Jackson County, whatever you want to call it. It's all those things. The Kirtland Temple, which I was there for, and I documented. If you missed that, just go check out my previous videos over the last couple of weeks. But Kirtland Temple, Hiram, which was headquarters of the church for a while, Sacred Grove, and Fayette. So, you guys, these eclipses now, just one more thing to make it even more, I think, specific to the church. The one temple, the one path that this path of annularity could take through the state of Utah and miss all the temples and only go over one operating temple, that's the path that it took. And it just happened to be the Monticello, Utah temple, the first of this series of small temples. Very odd, very strange, and it feels like it's highlighting that maybe the significance of that is it's like pointing us to the fact that there's going to be just more and more and more temples. You know, we've seen that with President Nelson. Maybe it's just going to explode. Maybe it's going to continue. I don't know. I want to remind you, we've heard some things like from some of you that have said that, like Elder Bednar was talking to President Nelson and talking about the number of temples. And then President Nelson said, you better put a 0 on the end of that number, implying that there would be thousands of temples. And, obviously at some point that will be the case. I don't know how soon. If he tried to get to like 1,000 temples, they're under construction, announced, or in operation during his lifetime, that's going to be a lot of temples announced. I don't think that that's going to be the case. It's probably going to be measured, but maybe sooner than later we'll get to that point where we have 1,000 or more temples. But that's all just you have to take that with a grain of salt. I don't have any direct source for that, but it's not that I doubt it, but it's something interesting to think about. Okay, so and then he says, as you know, President Hinckley's stated goal is to have at least 100 temples in operation by the end of this century. Knowing the president as I do, I'm sure that goal will be met, if not exceeded. Okay, later, April 1999 General Conference, True Followers by Elder Robert J. Wetton of the 70. He brings this up again. Every mission in the church needs more missionary couples, and the soon-to-be 100 temples in operation need more workers. So that stood out to me. He's reminding members of the church of the acceleration and the hastening of the work, but then he also talks about the fact that, hey, there's the practical aspect. These temples don't just magically pop up and then they're fully staffed. You're going to have to do that. And we've talked about that here on this spreadsheet, talking about the member to temples ratio. Basically what I did, I took just year by year, I took the number of temples in operation in this column and then the number of members in the church, and then came up with a ratio. Well, no, sorry, here's the number of members in the church, and then here's the ratio right here. And, you can see the different times where they've needed to build more temples because the ratio goes up. You have more and more members of the church per temple. And so when it gets to a certain point, you have to bring that back down and spread it out. Well, and it got really bad. It looks like right here, like in the 80s. Anyway, so I've taken the average throughout all of church history, the average ratio of number of temples to number of members. And with how many temples are currently announced and under construction and in operation, Actually, I think I need to update this because this is still when I was at 335 before the. So I haven't updated it since this conference. But in order to kind of keep things normal, like number of members to temples, the church is going to have to experience like pretty significant growth. Something like on the low end, 32 million people, and on the high end, 42 million people. So the church itself is going to have to like double in size in order to kind of like keep things the way that they are. Because once you get below a certain threshold, you don't have enough people to man the temple, because you think about that number, but that also includes children, that includes less active and inactive members of the church. So at some point you are scraping the bottom of the barrel, and you have to keep that ratio up in order to staff the temples. So I feel like that's an indication of future growth, but it's just interesting that he mentions this in his talk. And then back to President Hinckley in a talk called This Great Millennial Year, October 2000 General Conference. And he says, another item of remarkable consequence emphasized in this millennial year is the building of temples. It has been a miracle. Last Sunday, we dedicated in Boston, Massachusetts, the 100th working temple of the church. I think it's really interesting that Boston was the 100th because of its unique place in American history and the Revolution. I came into the first presidency in July of 1981 as a counselor to President Kimball. Since that time, 81 of these 100 temples have been dedicated. 81, so 81%. Only 19 were operating before then. 53 new temples. More than half of the 100 now in operation have been dedicated since I was ordained president of the church 5 years ago. I mention this only to remind you of the acceleration of this dramatic expansion. When I announced in conference that I hope to see the dedication of the 100th operating temple before the end of the year 2000, I wondered if it were possible. I cannot say enough thanks to the many men and women who have worked so long and so hard to bring this miracle to pass. Some of these new temples are smaller, but every ordinance that can be performed in the Salt Lake Temple, the largest in the church, can be performed in these smaller temples. They are devoted exclusively to ordinance work. They are beautiful structures, well built in every respect, and they have made possible a much easier journey to the house of the Lord for thousands upon thousands of our people. We shall go on building them. We will dedicate 3 more before the end of the year. So they exceeded the goal, because that was what Elder Ballard was wondering and thinking. We will continue to build in the future, perhaps not on the scale we have worked on during the past year, but there will be a steady construction of these sacred houses to accommodate the needs of the people. So if we look at that year, there were 33 temples dedicated in the year 2000. I have them highlighted right here. From the 69th Temple of the Church, the St. Paul, Minnesota Temple, to the Porto Alegre, Brazil Temple, 33 temples. And that has not been matched since that time. And you wouldn't think that that would happen unless there was like a similar, like really large announcement. And that is what's happening with President Nelson. There's also been, it seems like it's also been said, or people have reported that Elder Benhar said, expect to see, going forward, like 50 temples dedicated a year. And that's not really surprising, is it? Because look at all these temples right here that are announced and under construction. It's going to have to be like that. So I think pretty soon here, we are going to pass up the year 2000 with its 33 temples that were dedicated. Okay, now let's skip forward to President Nelson. In an article called October Temple Milestones, Why the Numbers 300, 118, 18, and even 1 Matter. There's a couple things here. We've talked about this on the channel independently before this article, but it's just really helpful to have this up. It says, and the lot, try 300, as in the church's latest total number of worldwide temples announced, under construction, or dedicated. 300 total temples. In April 2022, when President Russell M. Nelson announced 17 new temples, it made for an even 100 temple locations he had announced since becoming president of the church in January 2018. And we've talked about this because that was a really interesting conference, the April 2022 General Conference. There were a lot of 17s going on, not just with the number of temples that he announced, but remember, he's the 17th president of the church. His main talk, called The Power of Spiritual Momentum, was 17 minutes and 17 seconds long. And remember, we know from Sherry Do that he does do things like this. He does find significance in the length of his messages and the time and whatever. He does things very intentionally, and it seems symbolically. So there was 17 minutes, 17 seconds in his main talk. And then also his last talk of that conference, called Now is the Time, he shared a poem. He gave a talk 17 years before this, another talk called Now is the Time to Prepare. And in both talks, he shared the same poem about a sundial at Wells College, I think, or it's like a college in New York, but 17 years apart. So 17 years apart with these like companion talks. His main talk, 17 minutes and 17 seconds. And there were more, but I'm not going to go over all that here. I'll put a link for some of these videos that I've already done talking about 17 and 18, because for a while there we were really looking at 17 and 18. 17 is 10 plus 7 together, though they're both two numbers of perfection and completion. 7 in the sense of creation, 10 in the mathematical sense. That's how Jews look at it. In our church, looks at 7 as like a number of perfection and completion. And then 18, when you go from 7 to 8, 8 is like a new cycle. You go through one cycle of creation and then you start the next cycle starting with 8. And President Oaks will be the 18th president of the church if that's what happens. So there's like just a bunch of stuff about 17 and 18. I'll put the links for these videos in the description box below if you want to find out more, because it's been a while since we've really like covered that. So going back to this, so April 2022, he announced 17 temples, one of many 17s of that conference, to complete 100 that he's announced. And then the next conference, it says, in the closing session of October 2022 General Conference, President Nelson announced 18 new temple locations, 18 being another key number for the last month. That upped the church's total of all temples from 282 to the 300 mark. Okay, so the previous conference, 100 that he himself had announced. And then the next conference, he used 18 to complete 300 total for the entire church. So it's almost like he intentionally was trying to get to these even numbers, 100 for himself and 300 total for the church. Very interesting. Very interesting. So there is reason to believe when the number is doubled, there's going to be some significance in that, or it'll be highlighted. Let's see. No, I don't have anything from there. Okay. Now, there's a couple other things. This is from Deseret News, a brief history of Latter-day Saint temple announcements. And at the beginning of the article, President Gordon B. Hinckley announced 78 temples during his administration, which spanned nearly 13 years. Until Sunday, that had been the most temples announced during one church president's administration. But then it was passed up by President Nelson. So this article is from October 7th, 2021. That's when the number of temples announced by President Hinckley was surpassed by President Nelson. And you have to wonder, like, what's going to happen in the future? Is somebody going to surpass President Nelson? I would say yes. How soon? I don't know. But again, looking at this spreadsheet, it seems like they're expecting really large growth. And there's more reason to believe that than just looking at this spreadsheet. I've done videos about it. Things that President Nelson has said. He said that we're just at the point of exponential growth for whatever reason. So anyway, yeah, it's probably going to happen at some point. that President Nelson himself will be passed up. And then back to this first article that we were looking at, a couple other things. Announcing 20 temples is something President Nelson has done before. In fact, twice. He identified 20 new temple locations at both the April 2021 and October 2023 General Conferences, with those two instances serving as the church's benchmark for the most new temple locations identified at one time. So for any given general conference or any time that a president of the church has announced temples, those two conferences were the most temples ever announced at one time. So there are just all sorts of temple records being broken. We're living in a very exciting time. And then probably later this year, when the number is doubled, when President Nelson will have doubled the number of temples in the church during his presidency, that's going to be another really big milestone. I think all of these are significant. We should pay attention to it. Like I said, at the very least, it's a sign that the work is hastening and things are getting really serious, and we need to go to the temple. If you haven't been, you should go if the time, if the time is right for you. But they're like really starting to stress, like before, like for example, for women, it was like, if you're going on a mission, yes, you need to go to the temple. If you're not going on a mission, then typically you'll wait until you get married, or just you kind of fill it out for yourself. But now it's like they're just stressing like, no, you should go as soon as possible. We're not really doing things the way that we did before. We would encourage you to go to the temple for women when you can. And yeah, so anyway, that's going to be it for this one. So again, thank you, Gary, for this email. Just another thing to look forward to. We're living it in a very exciting time. But that's going to be it for this one. If you haven't already, please make sure to subscribe, like this video if you liked it, leave your thoughts and opinions down in the comments below. Also make sure to share it, and I'll talk to you guys later.